I do want to start with just thanking everyone that's tuning into the presentations today. My talk today is on equity through community access to climate action information. And similar to Kalina's talk, we'll be looking at the social science side of coastal science and policy, specifically climate equity. So before we get into that though, let's zoom out a bit. If you're tuning into this presentation, then you've likely heard of the term climate change. It's a term that's used often, but I want to ensure that there's clarity in the definition. So climate is defined as long-term patterns of weather in an area. So climate change is a term used for changes to these patterns. These changes are often the result of human activity, such as greenhouse gas emissions, and climate change causes a number of harmful impacts, and we'll go into those in the coming slides. But first, let's narrow into our geographic focus area of Oakland, California. Oakland, which is highlighted in red in the image you see, is one of the major coastal cities found in the United States' most populous state of California, and climate change impacts it in a variety of ways. So because Oakland is a coastal city, sea level rise threatens coastal residents, and it's estimated that by 2030, sea levels could rise by 1 foot, changing the landscape of beaches and waterfront properties. This would also impact flooding events after storms, and it's estimated that one severe storm in Oakland could cause 3 feet of flooding above levels recorded in 2000. Another issue Oakland faces is extreme heat. And just this year alone, Oakland set 3 temperature records in the past few months and broke the record for the hottest day of the year, which had been previously set back in 1989. These rising temperatures incur red flag warnings, which are alerts for wildfires. And I'm sure everyone remembers the summer of 2020, where the wildfires were major news, and the state of California lost an estimated 4.3 million acres alone. These wildfires are particularly damaging to property, but the wildfire smoke also presents an issue in Oakland. And during wildfire season, it becomes difficult and often dangerous to be outdoors, breathing this toxic air in. And it's been shown that hospitalizations for breathing issues have been increased during wildfire season. For these mentioned climate impacts and more, not all communities face them to the same extent. Some communities fare worse than others, and this climate vulnerability is determined by exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure references the proximity to climate impacts. So for example, a coastal resident would face more exposure to sea level rise than an inland one. Sensitivity relates to human factors that make you more susceptible to climate impacts. So someone that has asthma would be more sensitive to wildfire smoke than the average individual. Lastly, adaptive capacity is a resiliency of an area to react to climate impacts. So a community with internet access would be more able to be notified of an extreme weather event and be better prepared than one that does not. So as a diverse city, Oakland has a number of populations that can be considered vulnerable to climate change based on their characteristics, and we'll go through some examples now. So those with lower income are less likely to have access to resources, and the number you see in parentheses is the national average. And you'll see that Oakland has a higher than average number for all of the ones that we'll go through. The amount of young people in an area is also significant, as their bodies are more vulnerable to changes in temperature, and they're unable to adapt to the extent that the average adult is. Foreign-born individuals and non-speaking citizens are important to acknowledge as well due to access to resources. In some areas, the country does not effectively support non-English speakers and even discriminates against foreign-born individuals. This leaves those groups more sensitive to climate impacts. And lastly, unhoused population numbers are important, as access to shelter is a huge factor in responding to climate impacts. And again, these are just a few of the many groups that are found in Oakland that can be considered vulnerable to climate change, and it's these groups that climate action must focus on. Thankfully, Oakland has been taking steps towards climate action and focusing on vulnerable communities. The first step was to acknowledge that unequal impacts exist. This is due to not only present circumstances, which are reflected in the population percentages that we just looked at, but also past circumstances, which include discriminatory historical policies that led to redlining, underlying health condition, lack of access to resources, and more. Oakland has also made an effort to explicitly define climate equity, a phrase you'll hear me reference a lot. This term incorporates both environmental justice and racial and economic equity and enables all people, regardless of identity, to take an active role in designing and implementing solutions. Also, because the impacts of climate change affect vulnerable communities first and worst, climate equity inherently calls for an end to the climate crisis and its inequitable impacts. These efforts towards climate equity are outlined in Oakland's Climate Action Plan, called the Equitable Climate Action Plan, or ECAP, another term you'll hear me reference a lot. The ECAP was adopted in 2020 and is holistic and forward-thinking and guides city policy in a more sustainable direction. The ECAP is currently in its implementation phase as the city is working to achieve the goals outlined within it. So now that you have this background, you're probably asking yourself the same question I was: where could I possibly fit in a project? Oakland is already on the right path, so what kind of project could I develop that could be equity related, meaningful, but also something that has not been done before? That's when I started dwelling on access. Much of equity is about access to resources, and one of the most important resources is information. The ECAP itself contains a wealth of climate information, but going through the almost 150 pages is not always ideal. Additionally, the ECAP contains plans on what the city could do when the plan was adopted, but there's nowhere that showcases what is being done in the present. With that in mind, I knew I would need to create something that would have three major features. One, the consolidation of relevant ECAP efforts. Two, a way to keep the community informed. And three, a way to track efforts and be transparent on progress. These three things would help with continued implementation of the ECAP, so I used this to craft the project. So working with the City of Oakland's Environmental Services Division as my capstone partner, I came up with the capstone, highlighting equity progress to bolster Oakland's ECAP implementation. There are three objectives with this project. The first was to identify city projects that work towards climate equity goals found in Oakland's ECAP. The second objective is to create a tool that effectively highlights the progress made towards climate equity goals. And the third is to develop a method to share this tool with the general public and target communities. For objective one, I needed to identify city projects that work towards the ECAP's goals. This was done through a landscape analysis in which I parsed through city projects and efforts with the goal of identifying all that were climate equity related. During this time, I noticed that many of the city's departments lacked a central place with project information. So much of this search was done by simply going through news headlines, Googling major projects, and looking through the archives found on different city pages. In an effort to identify projects I may not have been able to find, I also contacted City of Oakland employees from different departments to interview them and gain insight on projects they thought might be relevant. This did mean I was gathering a lot of information, so it was important to set some parameters to help me. So as I gathered this extensive list, I made sure to distinguish projects based on which section of the ECAP they best fit into. These ECAP sections can be found listed in the figure to the left, and information on who to contact and other details will be input for each related project into this final product. So the final product for the first phase was a spreadsheet, and it is a fluid product, meaning that additional projects, contacts, and more are being added as new information is found. So as you can see here, this is a snapshot of the introductory page of the spreadsheet. At the bottom, you can see that I created tabs for each of the ECAP sections. I also created additional tabs, such as one for general contacts that I could reach out to for specific topics, and another tab contained additional resources. These resources were documents, websites, etc., that were not necessarily city projects, but I deemed useful nonetheless. Objective 2 of the capstone involved creating a tool that could effectively highlight the city efforts on climate equity that I had gathered. I decided the ideal tool for this would be a story map. So what is a story map? A story map is a unique web-based platform that integrates map, text, photos, and video, and provides functionality such as swipe, pop-ups, and time sliders that can help users explore content. As for why a story map, I felt this was the best tool for a number of reasons. One, their creative, innovative approach that encourages usage. Additionally, many departments have map data, so it's best to use a platform that is already map friendly. Story maps also allow users to visualize and understand content in greater detail, while also allowing a narrative to be associated with it. In order to build out the story map, I selected the most impactful or easy to showcase projects from the vast list that I had gathered. The ECAP sections didn't fit in the flow of the story, so I changed them to better reflect the group of projects that I had selected. I do know it's hard to picture exactly what I'm describing with the story map, and I plan to share the draft version of the tool during this presentation. However, I do want to ensure that I receive the approval of all of the contributors from other departments in terms of the best content to highlight, and also want to make sure that it's a finished product before I share it widely. So though I won't share the link right now, I did create a video of me going through it, through a couple of the sections to help visualize the work that was done for this part of my capstone. And please let me know if you can hear the audio.
So as mentioned, a story map is a uniquely accessible web-based platform that allows you to tell a story with not only words, but also with maps, web apps, images, videos, and more. For my capstone, that story was highlighting the efforts made by Oakland towards the ECAP's many goals. Readers are able to go through the entire story map or take advantage of the table of contents, which can be seen here. This allows you to either scroll through the entire thing or go to a specific section if you'd prefer that. I won't be going through the entire thing for the sake of time, but we'll be visiting different sections to help give you an idea of the features that can be found in this tool. A key component I considered vital for every section was providing links to the source material of a mentioned effort, or web pages that contain more information. This is meant to be a tool to highlight a number of the projects and efforts related to climate equity. With that comes limitations though, as you can only fit so much information onto a page before it becomes overwhelming. So this story map summarizes a lot of the information and then directs those that would want to learn more to the appropriate location by simply clicking a link. This was done for content in every section where relevant. So for example, here where ECAP is defined, clicking the link takes you directly to the ECAP's home page, and here readers can go into the ECAP and read more about it if they're interested. One unique aspect of story maps is the integration of interactive maps directly into your narrative. In this instance, I decided to highlight some of the maps Oakland may use to identify areas vulnerable to climate impacts. These maps, respectively, were created by the California Environmental Protection Agency and Oakland's Department of Transportation Race and Equity team. For both maps, users can interact with them directly on this tool at the click of a button and learn more about their region of Oakland. There's also the option to incorporate static maps, which can become images directly onto the story map as well. These images often showcase the narrative more effectively than words, and using the swipe feature on this tool allows readers to compare two maps side by side using an interactive slider. The two maps here, provided by the Tree Services Division, show us tree cover and green spaces in Oakland compared to land surface temperature. Looking at the two maps, you can see the value of green spaces in decreasing land temperatures. The darker the areas of green, generally, the less red there is in that area, and vice versa. Lastly, I was able to build a number of mapping applications using data gathered from context throughout the city. For example, food security is an important aspect of climate resilience and a key section of the ECAP. An effort was made to identify all of the grocery stores and supermarkets over a certain size across the city, but these locations remain on the spreadsheet. I decided to place these onto a map and create the following application. This allows readers to input an address or location, and we'll type in City Hall in Oakland just to make it easy. And once you hit enter, you'll be shown grocery stores and supermarkets within a set distance, along with food recovery locations, which are places that recover excess food from producers and share them with the less fortunate. These can be opened up and viewed to see which areas and which grocery stores and supermarkets are within your proximity, and this can be done anywhere from 0 miles to 2 miles.
So for the third and final objective, I needed to brainstorm methods to share this tool with the general public and target audiences. For this, I created a communication plan, which outlined approaches that could be taken to share this story map. Ideas included workshops, social media, and community events, in an effort to target communities that have historically lacked access to climate information. There's the opportunity to work with community engagement organizations that have already identified these areas for other projects and can simply share my story map link as they continue to do engagement. This objective was about ensuring the work doesn't end at just compiling and showcasing information. I also want to make sure that this reaches the target audience. With these objectives outlined, I'm sure you can see how I crafted this capstone to fill the gaps I had identified. The first component was addressed through my landscape analysis. Compiling progress from a variety of locations and interviews allowed me to stockpile countless efforts the city has made towards climate equity in conjunction with the ECAP's goals. I was then able to showcase consolidated information in a unique form, and I strongly believe that if you truly want to address equity, then making the information not only accessible, but digestible as well. And I think the story map does just that. The communication plan then seeks to ensure that the audiences that lacked access are the ones that are targeted to gain access to information. Lastly, given the story map is a fluid product, there's the ability to track progress on projects and other city efforts and continually highlight new successes. So throughout the capstone year, there were a number of valuable lessons that I learned, and I'll go through some major ones. First and foremost, patience was the key component through this all. Much of the work was tedious, and I often had to wait days or even weeks to hear back from some contacts. Planning this capstone was also difficult due to general uncertainty on the feasibility of it, so remaining patient was important to ensuring that I was ready to kick things off once I gained approval. I was also able to build my map making skills this year. Prior to this, the last experience I had with GIS, a map making software, was about 5 years ago. My skills were pretty rudimentary, so much of the early period of the capstone was spent relearning and researching ways to create the maps and apps that I showcased. Additionally, I believe the value of your network is something that should never be taken for granted. I was sent in my position with the city of Oakland by someone that considered me a good fit, and I'm not sure what my capstone would have been had they not thought of me. So having people that know your interest area is key to success, as they can open doors for you that you never imagined. Lastly, I learned a lot about my work style during this capstone year. Having the ability to craft your own project was slightly frightening in the beginning, but I came to appreciate the opportunity to develop an independent work style. You work hard on a project when you're the one that created it, and you dedicate to seeing it realized. Some people can call it stubbornness, but I call it commitment. So if you've tuned into the other presentations, then you know there's more to the capstone than just the project itself. We're also encouraged to think about where we can go next from here. So next steps for the capstone itself, I do want to encourage a citywide direct contribution to the spreadsheet that I created, and encourage other city departments to directly input new projects that they work on that are climate equity related. So rather than me having to go through and parse for different projects, it would be a lot easier to have them do it themselves. Next would be to create a story map collection. This is a unique feature of story maps in which you can create a number of different story maps and have them all encompassed under one theme. So my dream would to have the one theme be climate equity and create different story maps for different sections that I created. An alternative approach would be to create a single holistic interactive map in which users can turn on or turn off different layers that showcase different topics related to Oakland's efforts on climate equity. I also do want to encourage replication of the approach that I used. As I mentioned, a lot of city departments don't necessarily centralize their data. So if that can be done, it would be meaningful to and improve access to climate equity information and general information as well too. And lastly, I'd like to do a 1-year update of the story map. So once I complete this story map in the coming weeks, ideally in the coming year, I'd have another update to be done. As for personal and professional, I'm not certain. I'm one to definitely go with the flow. And I do have a safety net, considering that I will be continuing to work with the city of Oakland for the next 1.5 years. And during that time, I will be continuing to work on my story map. I'll also be using the time to expand my network, given that I was able to be introduced to this opportunity through my network. There's the option to be introduced to a number of new opportunities as well too. And lastly, I don't want to rush to the future. Things will happen at their own pace. So I think slow and steady wins the race with that. I do want to give a big thanks to my capstone team, which included my faculty advisors, Dr. Sakina Jinnah and Dr. Erica Zavaleta, and my supervisor for this project at the City of Oakland, Shayna Hirschfield Gold. It's been a long capstone year, and they were always patient with me as I figured things out and were quick to respond when I needed feedback. I fully believe my independent work style worked well because I knew if I had any missteps, I'd have an amazing team ready and willing to support me as needed. I also want to thank my summer placement partners, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Climate Team, or OPR, and Environmental Science Associates, or ESA. Both opportunities provided me with supportive teams and valuable work, and my former colleagues at both locations will be long-term connections. Lastly, I want to acknowledge other contributors, including the Environmental Services Division, which I work with the City of Oakland, those outside my division that contributed, my entire CSP faculty, staff, and cohorts, and the numerous other contacts that I've made through my time in this program. And with that, I'll take questions.